Good morning, folks. Beautiful morning here in central Ontario, Canada. I'm out here amongst my red pine trees in my red pine plantation. Now, about 45 years ago or so, I'm told, this whole area was wide open and then it got planted with these red pines. And well, these red pines need a little bit of maintenance, and that's what I'm doing. Now, I'm probably a little bit behind the 8-ball here. I should have done some thinning a while back, but the truth is I wasn't on this land right from the beginning. And so I'm sort of playing catch up. Now, what I'm going to catch up on is thinning these trees, and I'm going about it in a bit of an organized way. So if you've seen my previous videos, you may know that I have had foresters out here. I do have a good forestry plan in place, and that's more or less what I'm following. I'm trying to maintain the health of the forest, and I'm only one person, so I do what I can. What I'm going to do here today, as I said, is thin some trees. I'm going to follow along by thinning every third row, or is it fourth row? Maybe it's every fourth row. Can't remember. Every fourth row of trees. And if you're wondering what the row of trees are, just have a look down there. There's a row, there's a row, there's a row, etc., etc. Now, these trees would have been planted with approximately 6-foot spacing between rows, 6 feet between subsequent trees. You can sort of see that right here. Now, a lot of trees survived in here, so that would be called high survivorship. I would typically expect maybe a little bit more mortality in here, but you ended up with more trees that survived. That's somewhat good because I've got more trees to pick from, but it's somewhat bad because, well, some of the trees are squeezing out each other for resources. What that's going to do is stunt the growth of the trees, and so that's why we got to get in here and thin them out. Now, one of the reasons the trees might have been planted in this sort of spacing is to make it so that the limbs don't grow very big, sort of like a self-pruning method. If you look up there into the canopy, you'll notice there's no large limbs. Of course, unless you get to the crown of the tree, but no large limbs really survived. They're more or less competing for resources. They fall off, break off, end up on the ground. You don't have to go through and prune them by hand, and that's a nice thing. Close spacing can also help with a bit of a wind buffer, so you get a big wind through here. The trees are fairly dense in here, so you're not going to get a huge blowdown. However, if I don't get in here and thin, what can happen is the trees will continue growing upwards, but they won't grow much outwards, and so they're not going to be very stable. And so you will get a wind eventually, which I tend to get regularly. And if you don't get those trees thin before they get too high and too thin around the bottom, well, they'll just blow over all at once. And if you've ever seen a mass blowdown, it's kind of disheartening. So I don't want that to happen. If you look in this stand here as well, you'll also see some trees did pretty well. So they more or less outcompeted other trees for resources, water, nutrients, sunlight, etc. That tree right there, it died. I can often tell a tree's dead without even looking at the top because there's fungi growing on it. See all the little mushrooms and stuff? That tree's doing pretty good. That tree died. That tree did okay. That tree's kind of stunted. That tree did okay. That tree did okay. How about these ones? These did okay. They're actually on the bigger side in this area. The reason these are bigger is because they got more spacing around them. At some point before my time, someone came in here and cleared out a few trees. Maybe they died, who knows? But because they have a bit more spacing, they're doing pretty well. That's sort of the whole premise behind thinning. Looking in this way, you'll notice there are some trees on the ground already. So I came through maybe last winter and I cut down some of the less desirable trees, and I did that on purpose, just trying to open things up a little bit, making a bit safer for me. I was trying to make it so dead trees wouldn't fall on my head unexpectedly. Anyways, that's why those are on the ground. As I said, we're about to take down a few more. If you look down here, I took down a row of trees here in the past. Notice the spacing here is wider. If we come up a little bit further, we would typically count to 4. 1, 2, 3, and then we cut down this row. And so if you follow that'll be the row we tackled today. And then we'll count to the 4th row again. 1, 2, 3, and this row here I have cut down previously as well. You can see the stumps there. So that's sort of the premise here. That'll give me a bit better access for equipment, open up the canopy a little bit for more sunlight. Eventually, when the time comes and I get back in here for a second thinning, which at this point I can barely get through a first thinning, but let's assume I get to a second thinning, I can get my equipment down here and we'll start to gather trees from those rows that are left behind. Anyways, that's gonna do it for me here. I'm gonna get down to it, suit up, and we'll fire up the chainsaw. Here we go. Oh, just one more thing I should mention here. Typically with these rows of trees, what I would do is I would go to the far end and I would start cutting at that end and have all the trees fall away from me. And then essentially they'd stack up on each other like dominoes. And then I have the butt end facing out towards the skidding trail, and then I could pull them. Well, in my case, because it's the summer, I'm not going to be able to get them cut down, skidded, sawn before the bugs get into them. So I'm only going to cut down a few trees today, just enough trees that I can tackle in the next little while. Otherwise, I'll end up with a bunch of trees with holes in them from boring insects. Well, there's our full-length logs, and oftentimes I'll skid them exactly as they are right over to the sawmill, but we have a lot of sharp corners en route there, and I don't want to damage the trees on the inside corner yet. And so I figure I'll cut these to the length for the lumber I'm going to make out of them at this point, and then I'll use the grapple here to take it over to the sawmill. Folks, there we have it. That's about 6 down, 5,000 or so to go, but I guess who's really counting? I suppose I am. I've got a heck of a lot of trees left to harvest, but I'm out here enjoying myself. I feel good. I get lots of fresh air, and I get to use the trees on my own property for my own use. And I think that's a win in my book. Probably goes without saying, with 5,000 trees left to harvest and me all by myself, I'm going to be out here probably the rest of my life. Now, I don't want to be thinning the rest of my life though, but for now I'll continue using the equipment I have. I've got the chainsaw, I've got the Forestry grapple on the back. Sometimes I put a grapple on the front, and we'll make the best of it. Now, in terms of actually cutting down the trees, a chainsaw could tackle 5,000 trees, no problem. I'm not sure if the operator here could do it, but it could do it nonetheless. The trouble is, though, processing the logs. Once I get the trees on the ground and I measure their length, I take off the small limbs, I skid them over to the sawmill, and I make them into lumber. That is an awful lot of time. I could walk down this row of trees and probably this morning take down all of them in this row, but I wouldn't get them processed in time before they rotted, and I don't want the trees to go to waste, and therefore I'll keep plugging away. Now, based on my past experiences with the red pine and my climate here, I find that the trees typically last in the summertime, laying on the ground or even elevated on blocks, usually only a few weeks before the bugs, the boring bugs, start getting into them. So once they're cut down, I gotta more or less start the clock and get them milled, at least get the bark off them before those bugs get into them. With that in mind, that's why I would prefer to saw logs. I would prefer to cut down trees in the wintertime, because then I have a lot more time on my hands. In the wintertime, I can cut down a tree, and assuming it doesn't become spring for several months, those trees can sit there piled up for those several months before I really got to get the bark off and get them sawn. Not to mention, in the wintertime, I prefer harvesting trees like this because I can skid the trees and not worry about getting dirt in the bark. You would have seen dirt there. Well, that dirt is going to dull up my chainsaw, potentially my sawmill blades, and I don't like that, but such is life. Now, the forestry grapple you saw me using, I'm really liking this addition here, because once I do all the processing of the trees on the ground here and they're in log form, I don't have to get out of the tractor again. I just sit inside there sipping sludge. I got the radio going and the AC, and I more or less just maneuver the tractor, pick up the logs, I can bunch them up and skid them over there. I also like that because I can skid them lengthwise, whereas if I were to use my forks and try to just pick up the logs, some of those logs were over 16 feet long. There's no way I'm getting down these narrow trails with the logs sideways. So one of the nice additions here, I'll continue using that as I make my way through these 5,000 trees. Anyways, that's going to do it for me here today. If you have any questions about my red pine plantation, the overall setup that I've got going, be sure to put it down below in the comments. If you like this content and you haven't done so already, make sure you subscribe. Everyone, please give me this like-a-roo, and don't forget, I've got sawingwithsandy.com out there, along with some new social platforms on Instagram, TikTok, and Facebook. Join me there. I'll see you then.